Immediately following World War II, the Cold War begins. And in fact, some of the things that ended World War II are the things that led to the cause of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, of course, is the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that never blossomed into an all out United States versus Soviet Union on the battlefield war, but is this series of conflicts and proxy wars or friends fighting for each other throughout the 50s all the way up into the 90s. So this is a long, drawn out conflict. There are two primary causes. I'm sorry, the primary cause of the war is that both the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union wanted to spread their worldview. The United States is always talking about, capitalism and democracy and spreading that throughout the world. We can see that all the way back in World War I with Woodrow Wilson talking about making the world safe for democracy. Good, noble things. From the Soviets' point of view, though, that's a threat. And from the American point of view, the Soviets' communist dictatorship and their effort to spread through Eastern Europe and then even beyond, that was a threat to the United States. So you have two different worldviews coming into conflict with each other, and both thinks they're right and that the other side is essentially evil. Um, Throw in the fact that during World War II, the Soviet Union distrusted the United States because of all the delays in opening up that second front. Now, Britain and the United States had legitimate reasons for those delays, and they could argue that they tried to open up a second front with Operation Torch and it failed. They can talk about how it took time to get the boats ready to, and the weather had to be right to launch D-Day, Operation Overlord. But from Soviet Union leader Stalin's point of view, this was simply excuses. And that the United States and Britain, these capitalist democracies, just wanted to allow more time for the Nazis to kill off more communists. Now, that's probably not true, but from his point of view, it really fed into the paranoia of Stalin's mentality. They also saw Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dropping of the atomic weapons, as unnecessary to win the war and was meant as a threat to the Soviet Union rather than a way to end the war and save American lives. So the Soviet Union sets up a series of Eastern satellite states. They looked at all the previous wars in Europe and realized that World War I and World War II, the Europeans had attacked the Soviet Union through Eastern Europe. So the Soviets wanted to set up these satellite states, these proxy states, these friends along Eastern Europe that would be communist and be controlled by the Soviet Union. Churchill describes this political and economic divide between Eastern and Western Europe as an iron curtain because there was no way to get across it and there was no way to get through it. It's a metaphor, and the Berlin Wall, which is going to be created in the 60s, that becomes that physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain later on. Oh, here's the Iron Curtain, right? This red line dividing east and west. We've got the bear here, right? Bear representing the Soviet Union. You got little Uncle Sam at the bottom down there, afraid of Soviet expansion. So that's really the problem for the United States. They're willing to accept a world with the Soviet Union because it's hard to defeat an idea, right? The idea of communism. So what the United States wants to do is not try to overthrow the Soviet Union, not try to militarily take them out. Just got done with World War II. The Soviet Union is also a superpower. The United States isn't interested in going to war. But what they want to do is try to contain the spread of communism, right? Kind of like quarantine an infection. Just don't let the Soviet Union spread and get bigger. Because you can't militarily defeat them, but you can contain the spread and try to prevent other countries from becoming communist. And the way that they wanted to do that was by making communism less attractive. So if you look at the reasons why communism existed, it goes back to this industrial threat. People are poor, the working conditions are bad. So the United States says, well, how do we make communism less attractive? We got to make the economies better, right? And this is the basis of the Truman Doctrine. You can think of this as fighting communism with cash or containing communism with cash. The Truman Doctrine was essentially just the idea that the United States would support any country that was fighting against communism. He said armed minorities, meaning invasion, or by outside pressures like Soviet Union pushing them to become communist. Now, the way they do that is make communism less attractive by propping up their economies. This takes place through the Marshall Plan. And you can see over here on the side, right, these stacks of dollar bills, they represent how much money was being given by the United States to those countries to help rebuild. Remember the lesson of World War I. The Germans were embarrassed. Their economy was ruined by the reparations payments. And that led Hitler to have this crack, this opening to take historical anti-Semitism and his racist policies and build up the Nazi Party. So the Marshall Plan was this idea that if you give countries money, build up their economy, they start flourishing, then people will be less likely and less interested in communism because the economy would be good and everything will be fine. So they don't have to worry about, the economy. They don't have to worry about things like, struggling proletariats and all that. So they just gave away lots and lots of money. And if you notice down here in this map, the countries that didn't take any Marshall Plan money were all members of that Soviet Union, Eastern European Iron Curtain. Stalin was really unhappy about this, right? Because by making communism less attractive, he couldn't spread communism, which is a basis of a communist philosophy. So in order to get revenge on Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, he set up a blockade of Berlin. You see, at the end of World War II, the United States wanted to maintain its presence in Europe. And if you see here, this pink area right below here, that's controlled by the Soviet Union. But those other three sections on the other side, those are controlled by Britain, France, and the United States. And they're going to form its own individual country called West Germany. So you have East Germany and you have West Germany. But this city right here of Berlin, that's the capital of Germany. So both the United States and the Soviet Union and Britain and France want to have some influence in Berlin. So they also carved Berlin in half. So you had a West Berlin, which is a capitalist democracy, and a communist Berlin, which is controlled by the Soviet Union. And West Berlin is going to become a sticking point because it is going to maintain its capitalist democracy philosophy within an ocean of Soviet communism. So when Stalin gets mad about the Marshall Plan, he decides to just cut off West Berlin. Now, he doesn't invade West Berlin because that would cause an international incident, maybe even war. And this is a Cold War, not a hot war. So he just sets up all of his tanks and all that right here in this area, right? Because that's how the convoys would get in and deliver supplies to West Berlin. So he prevents Britain, France, and the United States from getting supplies to Berlin. He thinks that will cause West Berlin to cave. The Americans and the British will give West Berlin to him, and he'll win this great strategic, media victory, propaganda victory. But the United States and Britain have a different idea. They use their technological advantage to get around the blockade. So instead of trying to drive through the tanks, causing the international incident, which would then lead to the war, they decide to fly airplanes across and over top, drop supplies into Berlin, and then go back home. So they fly over the tanks. And in this way, Stalin, if he decides to shoot at the airplanes, he starts the war. Stalin didn't want to start the war. So now technically the United States won this conflict, but Stalin is embarrassed. And that's going to lead to more tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it's going to lead the Soviet Union to start building up all of its conventional weapons, which leads to a bigger arms race. Both the Soviet Union and the United States see this arms race starting to emerge. The United States decides that it cannot shrink back into Fortress America. We're living in a global economy now. There's nuclear weapons are now on the table. The United States feels responsible, and they think about the lesson that they did not do of what they didn't do after World War I. After World War I, the United States decided not to join the League of Nations. They didn't use their influence to keep world peace, and that helped lead to World War II. So the United States joins the United Nations the United States abandons isolationism and tries to become a world leader. They form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All these countries over here in blue, these are all NATO countries or American allies. These countries down here in red, they signed the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet system of allies. And you can see the conflict here already starting to emerge. You have Western Europe, you have Eastern Europe, you have the Iron Curtain going down the middle. This is going to cause a lot of conflicts throughout the next 50 years. The English and the United Nations also reflected on the Holocaust. And in 1948, England took its colony in the Middle East, which was referred to as Palestine, and they took Palestine and they gave that land to Israel under a United Nations agreement. And they carved Palestine into two countries, the country of Palestine and the country of Israel. This really angered the Arabic populations surrounding this new country of Israel, not just Palestine. Palestinians tended to be of Arab descent, and so did all the countries around it. Egypt, Jordan, a couple of others I can't think of off the top of my head. And those countries are going to have a long history of attacking Israel throughout the 60s, 70s, and this is still a basis of conflict even into the modern era. The United States became the first ally, immediately recognized Israel as a country, and immediately started giving them millions and eventually billions of dollars to help support the country. And again, this is all a response to the Holocaust and the embarrassment that the Americans had for not helping when they were refugees trying to escape. The 1920s had a Red Scare. Remember, we talked about the 1920s Red Scare. They were afraid of socialists and anarchists and immigrants. We're going to have a second Red Scare now in the 1950s. And red here represents radicals, which means, in this case, communists. And there's a couple of causes for this 1950s Red Scare. One is that China became a communist country. And that is a billion or so people that are going to be joining the military of China and that could potentially fight against capitalist America. This guy here, this is Mao Zedong. Mao, as he's known, was a communist leader, defeated the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, who went to the island of Formosa, and now we call it Taiwan. This is going to lead to a big problem. The United States does not recognize Mao's China for about 20 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. Instead, choosing to recognize the little island of Taiwan officially as China. It's not until the Nixon administration that that policy changes. And even today, we still have conflicts over what to do with China and Taiwan. There is a fear now that China, as a big power base in the in the Asian territories, has now spread and lead to communism elsewhere, like in Korea and Vietnam. The second thing that's going to lead to the Red Scare is going to be nuclear weapons. Now remember, at the end of World War II, Truman had used nuclear weapons as a way to promote peace and save American lives. Between 250,000 American soldiers they assumed would die in trying to occupy Japan. So they dropped the bomb as a way to end the war earlier and save American lives. At least that was the American logic. The Soviet Union saw that as a threat towards the Soviet Union, though, and that leads the Soviets to try to develop their own weapons. Now, it's pretty unlikely that they developed the technology on their own, and there's a lot of evidence that they used American spies in order to get some of the technology, because by 1949, the Soviet Unions have developed the atomic bomb. And this is the second cause of the Red Scare. The Soviet Union's development of the atomic bomb ends the American monopoly on atomic weapons. So now the United States can't just be going around threatening to bomb everybody. They have to consider what the Soviet Union will do, right? And this leads to a nuclear arms race. And you can see this chart over here on this side of me. The United States was winning on the nuclear arms race until around 1972, 73. Then the Soviets do actually build up bigger bombs. And the fear of this is that by the 1960s, there's so many nuclear weapons, and they've developed new weapons called hydrogen bombs that are much, much exponentially bigger than the Hiroshima bombs, that all life on the face of the earth would just be eliminated if anybody used these bombs. And that's the MAD policy. MAD stands for mutually assured destruction. The United States and the Soviet Union eventually come to this understanding that if either side uses nuclear weapons, the other side will use all their nuclear weapons. So it is not a good idea to use a nuclear bomb, because then all the nuclear bombs will be used and all life on Earth will be gone. So that's the Cold War mentality all the way through the 90s. That's what I grew up with, right? On no account should these bombs be used because the enemy might retaliate. That's mutually assured destruction. So they're going to use conventional weapons like this bow and arrow here instead. The first major conflict of the Cold War is going to be Korea. Korea is an Asian country, and the United States, when they thought they were going to invade Japan, had asked the Soviet Union to invade Japan with them. In order to set up their base of operations, the Soviet Union actually went into Korea and was going to hop from Korea over to the island of Japan. When they left behind communism. And North Korea was a communist section, and South Korea was a capitalist democracy. In 1950, you can see in this map here, North Korea decided to invade South Korea. So the communists are invading or expanding into a democratic area. And the American policy at the time is containment. Don't allow expansion. So the United States goes to the United Nations, and through some United Nations politicking, and there's some other stuff going on there we don't need to know, they get the United Nations to lead a police action. Okay. And the United States leads the soldiers that will be leading the United Nations into this police action to push the North Koreans out for illegally invading South Korea. And you can see in this chart here, the blue area that was all that was left of the democratic capitalists in South Korea. But the arrows are starting to push back. So because of the United States, the tables turn and they start pushing up into North Korea to the point where by November of 1950, okay, so only about 6 months later, you can see that the South Koreans have almost pushed the North Koreans all the way up into China. That's a problem for China because they don't want a democratic capitalist country on their border. So China threatens to intervene and use troops, Chinese troops, right? So you can see by 1953, there's essentially a stalemate here because the South Koreans and the United Nations have pulled back and decided to not push the issue with China and all that. Now, 33,000 Americans will die. About another 2 million South Koreans and North Koreans will die or be wounded or injured in this. And the question then becomes, is this worth it? And to the American containment policy, yes, right? Because the goal was not to eliminate communism, but to contain it. So if you look here, this was the border before, right, the invasion in 1950. And this is the border after, right? Right. So that 38th parallel is roughly the same border before and after, which means communism was contained, which means this is a victory for the United States and capitalism. That doesn't mean that communism is gone in the Asian territories. This country over here, you can see North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It had been called Indochina by the French, right? Both North and South Vietnam had been called Indochina. This guy here, Ho Chi Minh, was leader of communist forces in Vietnam, and he was using guerrilla war and conventional warfare even to fight the French to get them out of the colony, to throw off their French colonial oppressors. The French were actually defeated by Ho Chi Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the 1950s. And Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. You can see that area right here, right? The 17th parallel. And we had North and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was in charge of North Vietnam. There's a capitalist democracy put in place in South Vietnam. And according to this agreement following the French leaving Vietnam, there would be elections that would take place that would allow a government to be put in place in Vietnam. But the United States does not want communism expanding, so they step in and they take over for the French and start sending aids and troops to South Vietnam, eventually not even allowing the election because they thought that the communists would win. This is sometimes referred to as the domino theory, right? If Laos falls, Vietnam falls, Taiwan falls, Korea, Philippines, Japan, Canada, and all of a sudden it's in the United States. So if there's one little teeny tiny country in Asia falls, then eventually we're going to fall as well. Later on in the 1950s, in 1956, under the Eisenhower administration, the Suez Canal crisis becomes a problem. In 56, the Suez Canal is this little area right here. Let's say right here. The Suez Canal basically cuts the Sinai Peninsula away from Egypt, and big ships can go from the Red Sea into the Mediterranean and up into Europe. And what this does is allow all that oil from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Yemen, all that, instead of going all the way around Africa, right, all the way around Africa to get up to Europe, they could just cut through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. And that reduces prices of oil and other goods, especially later when China gets into the consumer goods. It makes things a lot cheaper. And Egypt here was where the Suez Canal was. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But Egypt had been flirting with the Soviet Union about building a couple of hydroelectric dams. And the Soviet Union was suggesting that they should turn communist and then they would build the dams. And there's a lot of stuff going on. But France and Britain over here and Israel, you can see Israel next to the Suez Canal there, they were nervous that if the Egyptians became communist, then the Suez Canal would become Egyptian communist property, and the Soviet Union wouldn't allow the Europeans, the Western Europeans, to use the canal. So England and England and Israel decide to come up with a plan. They essentially fake an invasion by Israel. The British step in to protect the Suez Canal from the Israelis, but it was all a ruse so that the British could control the Suez Canal. This makes Eisenhower and the United States very mad because the Egyptians may have been allies of the Soviet Union. And when the Egyptians found out that the British and the Israelis were basically working together to steal the Suez Canal from them, the fear was that the Soviets would step in and attack Britain. And because England, Britain, is an ally of the United States, that would kick in NATO and NATO's policy, which means the United States would have to step in and fight the Soviet Union. And then one thing would lead to another, and then there's nuclear war, and all of the world is going to blow up and everybody dies. So Eisenhower comes up with, first of all, Eisenhower made Britain give the Suez Canal back to Egypt and then apologize. And then he states the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is essentially just allowing the Truman Doctrine to apply to other areas, in this case, the Middle East. The United States would help use their economic power and military aid to fight against colonial expansion everywhere, not just in Europe. One of the things that really got the United States nervous during the Cold War was the launch of Sputnik. There's two reasons for this. One, the Soviet Union sent an artificial satellite into space. They beat the United States into space, and that is embarrassing. The United States is falling behind. This is a competition, and we're losing, and the United States felt like it's getting weak and dumb and unintelligent, so it needs to catch up. It starts pushing for new math and science education. They push for the National Education Defense Act, which gets more people into college, right? This is the birth of the idea of like STEM. Get more kids into math and science education. They create NASA to start funding. You can see here Uncle Sam is scared because the Sputnik is flying around the sky and beep, 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 and they feel like they've been complacent. Hey, Sputnik isn't very big. And the thing is, the second thing, not one is the United States falling behind, getting fat and lazy. Number two, though, Sputnik doesn't have to be just a little satellite that it emitted a little radio beep. It could also be a nuclear warhead. So the United States is also feeling like this is the end because the Soviets are going to develop better nuclear weapons, and then they're not going to have that mutually assured destruction anymore, and they're just going to go and blow up the United States. Communism is even coming into the Western Hemisphere. This is terrifying to the United States because this guy here, Fidel Castro, overthrew the American ally, President Batista, who is essentially an American puppet there, and sets up communism in the Western Hemisphere. And then Castro takes over all of the American-owned businesses in Cuba. and nationalizes them, turns them into Cuban government property. The United States immediately embargoes all stuff from Cuba, right? They just no trade with Cuba. And then the United States realizes that the Soviet Union and Cuba were going to be pretty friendly. And that's going to be the basis of the Cuban Missile Crisis we'll talk about a little bit. So all of this wraps up with the Red Scare, also called McCarthyism because the guy that starts this second Red Scare is a senator from West Virginia whose name is Joseph McCarthy. Excuse me. China, Korea, the Soviets, nukes, all of that leads to these anti-communist fears, which leads to the United States targeting a lot of civil liberties, First Amendment rights like free speech and free press and freedom of the religion. Harry Truman just kind of makes things worse because Republicans, McCarthy's a Republican, is they wanted to get the White House back. Democrats have been in power since 1932. It's now the 1950s. It's been 30 years or 20, 25 years that the Democrats have been in charge and the Republicans want it back. And they see that they can call the Democrats weak on communism. And that will get people to like Republicans more because they're going to fight communism. And the one way they do this is by making people scared. And Truman thinks he can fight this by saying, no, we're just going to have everybody in the government give a loyalty oath, right? You have to promise to be loyal to the Americans and the Americans' way of life. And that kind of backfires because then people said, well, if you have to have a loyalty oath, that must mean there's something to hide. The House of Representatives then created HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC. And HUAC was out there like accusing people of being communism, almost as if it's a witch trial, right? You make the accusation, and this is what McCarthy did, make the accusation, say it over and over and over and over again, and eventually some people will start believing that, yes, those Democrats do support communism and want that for the country. What HUAC often did was claim communists were all around the country and undermining the government. They even accused people in the movie industry of creating propaganda that was pro-communist and anti-American. They famously called in many celebrities, many directors, many people that were part of Hollywood, and tried to get them to accuse each other of being the real communists. And this went on and on and on and on. Future President Ronald Reagan was called before HUAC and gave up many names. But then there was 10 people, they called them the Hollywood 10, that refused to testify, saying that they had the First Amendment right to say whatever they wanted. And there is no law against promoting communist views, whether they were or not. They end up getting blackballed, which means that they lost their jobs and couldn't find any more work. One of the people that was accused of this was this guy here, Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller was upset by all this. He went on to write a book called The Crucible. And in this book, he describes the witch hunts. And this is actually just a whole metaphor, right? Because under McCarthyism, they're not really witches, just like they're not really communists. And it's the accusation that's driving fear and anger, which leads to the eventual downfall of everything. Oh, here's McCarthy here. McCarthy is the guy that started all these witch hunts. He liked to use a tactic called the big lie, of repeating false accusations, right? And when you repeat false accusations over and over and over again, eventually people start to think, well, there might be some truth to it, right? We see this constantly in the modern era, especially with social media, right? People lie all the time, and they just keep repeating that lie, and eventually people are like, well, there might be something to that. The lie that he was telling was this lie about the Democrats being communists or being weak on communism. He would often have these lists. He would say he had a list of known Democrats or known communists in the government or in the Democratic Party, and he would just keep making these accusations. And he made so many accusations so quickly that people couldn't refute them. So that message of Democrats bad, just kind of kept going on and on and on and on through the media. There were some rare examples that seemed to feed into this. Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs, and they're used to drive the narrative, although they were kind of the exceptions. So the second Red Scare all built on this Cold War stuff. And we're going to see some more specific examples in the next section here.